Let's talk about the time when the entire leadership for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were fugitives from justice. Today, the Latter-day Saint Church, at least in America, has a reputation for being wholesome, patriotic, and law-abiding, and that mostly holds true. But it's also not always been the case. And so today I want to talk about the half-decade or so in which the federal government was cracking down on polygamy, and Mormon leaders were running from the law, quite literally. One scholar has called this the longest episode of civil disobedience in United States history, because Latter-day Saint leaders believed that polygamy was their right, their genuine belief, and therefore protected under religious freedom. And so they chose to run from the law, have warrants out for their arrest, rather than concede. This is, by the way, the period from which we get John Taylor's famous quote that the saints would rally underneath the banner of heaven, which would later become the title of John Krakauer's best-selling book on the Lafferty brothers. Now, the Mormon Underground is a fascinating story in its own right, and I'm going to lay out some of the broader points and narratives. But it also produced crucial legacies that remain within the broader Mormon tradition even today. It's also relevant as Latter-day Saints gather, either yesterday or in the coming weeks in their Sunday school classes, to discuss Official Declaration 1, which is what brought the Underground period to a close. So let's dig in. Now, it's important to remember whenever discussing the Mormon practice of polygamy that plural marriage was never strictly legal. It was always an extra-legal practice. When Joseph Smith introduced it in Nauvoo, it went against Illinois anti-bigamy laws. And even when the Mormons established the Utah Territory, there were common law practices, first within the Mexican nation and then in the American Empire, that outlawed polygamy, common law practices that the Utah legislature tried to overturn when they organized the territory of Deseret. But then it became the focus of the American government trying to stamp out, believing polygamy was an affront on American civilization and had something that was oppressing individuals, women particularly, and therefore they had to do all they could to exterminate it. It became a central pillar of the Republican Party when it was formed in the mid-1850s, and in fact was on the first Republican national platform that they were going to stamp out the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. And the first legislation that was directly targeted to punishing those practicing polygamy, because remember, it was illegal. There was just not a mechanism that was easy enough to enforce. But in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Law, 1862, which limited church property ownership to $50,000 if you're practicing polygamy, something that would become important later on. It made practicing polygamy a criminal offense that the government could enforce. But importantly, the government did not enforce that 1862 Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, nor did they really plan to enforce it. The bill that passed did not grant any money or mechanisms through which they could bring these Mormon polygamists to justice. I mean, they had a lot on their hands. This is the middle of the Civil War. It was also impossible to enforce even if they wanted to, because Mormons were in control of the local court system in Utah, and so therefore they were just punting the polygamy issue down the road. The next major legislative movement came in the 1870s, in the 1874 Poland Act. Now, this is a time when Ulysses S. Grant, as a U.S. president, was trying to crack down on these dissonant practices of what they determined to be anti-democratic, whether it be the racial subjugation in the South or Mormon polygamy in the West. Importantly, the Poland Act of 1874 gave U.S. district courts control over civil and criminal trials, and it empowered the U.S. Marshal and U.S. Attorney to push these cases rather than relying on locals, which often would be Mormons. And importantly, it also made an effort to keep Mormons off juries. But even then, they weren't able to convict as many polygamists as they were expecting, both due to circumstances on the ground in Utah, as well as just broader national inefficiencies of enforcing these Reconstruction measures. And Mormons, they believe that they could still win this battle. They believe that polygamy was a genuinely held belief and therefore protected under America's Religious Freedom Clause. So in the wake of the Morrill Act, they got this guy, George Reynolds, who was a secretary to the First Presidency, to volunteer to be arrested on polygamy charges, tried so that they could appeal the ruling all the way to the Supreme Court. By the way, Reynolds, again, here he is, phenomenal beard. I always want to highlight the great beards when we get to them. Now, this eventually made it to the Supreme Court in 1877 in the Reynolds v. United States decision, which was one of the most important Supreme Court decisions of the era. It ruled two things. One, that the government both has the power and the interest to regulate moral issues like polygamy. And two, that religious belief does not mean religious practice. So you have the freedom to believe what you want, but you don't necessarily have the freedom to practice what you want. And that then set the stage for the next major era of the anti-polygamy crusades, laying the groundwork for the Underground. By the way, if you enjoy this type of nerdy analysis, and if you're watching this, I hope you do, otherwise you're just punishing yourself, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I try to do deep dives on historical topics or stories every Monday. I connect the past to the present on Wednesdays, and I talk about the historian's craft on Fridays, either through digging into primary sources or interviewing authors and talking about new books. And if you want to give back, which I always greatly appreciate, you can become a member of the channel, which through a very nominal fee, you can get early access to the videos and show your appreciation. Also, if you haven't yet, please make sure to subscribe to my Kit newsletter so you can get updates and links to everything that I'm involved with, both my videos here on YouTube, my posts on social media platforms, my interviews, my upcoming events. It's all lots of fun. And then every first Wednesday of every month, I do a live discussion here on the YouTube channel at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. The next one will be January 7th, which should be a lot of fun to kick off the new year, so mark your calendar now. All right, let's get back to the polygamy fights. Now, with their measures to try to stamp out polygamy reaffirmed with the Supreme Court, and now that the Reconstruction battles in the South were mostly over, which meant the Democrats were willing to no longer protect the Mormons and they were going to work with the Republicans, we got an escalation in anti-polygamy prosecution in the 1880s. Notoriously, in 1882, we got the Edmunds Anti-Bigamy Act. Importantly, what it did, it not just made polygamy a felony, but it made cohabitation a misdemeanor or a crime, meaning that one of the problems was they could never prove that these people were married to multiple women because they might just not get, the civil contract. But instead, if they could just prove that men were living with multiple women, that cohabitation, they could then be convicted up to 6 months in jail and a substantial crime. Importantly, it also made it so that polygamists, even the belief in polygamy, could not vote, hold office, or serve on juries, which is restricting the pool of people who are going to be making these decisions. Now, the first real trial that came in the wake of the Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act was of Rutger Clawson, this guy here. They brought him to trial. For a long time, the Mormons tried to hide his polygamous wives, including Lydia, but then in a very dramatic moment at one of the trials, it's a long, complicated legal story, they open the doors, in walks Lydia into the courtroom to locks of gas, and of course she is pregnant. So then he is convicted, and Rutger Clawson's final words before taken to jail was, quote, "I very much regret that the laws of my country should come in conflict with the laws of God, but whenever they do, I shall inevitably choose the latter." That kind of set the tone for how the Mormons were going to respond. By the way, Rutger Clawson would later become an apostle, proving his mettle through this ordeal. And with his conviction in 1883 to 84, the Underground period really began. The president of the LDS Church at the time was John Taylor, this dapper dude who is going to become famous in later Mormon lore for what he does during the Underground period. And he is faced with this conundrum of, is the LDS Church going to give in on what they believe to be their core doctrine, polygamy? That's how John Taylor defined it, the core doctrine. He dictated several revelations during this time, reaffirming that polygamy should never go away. But he also knew that they had to prepare for the problems that are going to come, especially the prosecution from the federal government. So they did things like looking into reclassifying temples as educational establishments rather than places of worship, which would protect them from being confiscated by the federal government. He also ordered expeditions to explore Mexico and Canada to see if the saints need to move once again. They also were preparing for what happens to testify. Wilford Woodruff, who is the president of the Quorum of the 12, his wives were interviewed by prosecutors, and he wrote a letter to his wives telling them to, quote, tell the truth, but as little of it as you can, which is a pretty good advice that I think lawyers typically give their defendants. They also, by the way, by Wilford Woodruff's request, started stashing guns and ammunition in the St. George Temple in case there's ever a siege. They planted saints in the sheriff's office in Salt Lake City so they can get a tip whenever there's an arrest warrant. And they also started dressing in disguise. Here is George Buchanan, who was foremost prominent Latter-day Saint leader during this era. He was known nationwide. He had to start dressing up in disguise whenever he walked in public. Here's my rendition of what that disguise might have looked like. Sometimes he was successful. He boasted in his diary one time that he was able to walk around downtown Salt Lake City with no one noticing. Other times it was less successful, with someone saying, hey, George, I could tell you a mile away, especially due to your big nose, which, you know, who among us does not have defining physical features that can evade disguise? But soon, George Buchanan and John Taylor heard that there were arrest warrants out for them. And so John Taylor spoke at his last public appearance on February 1st, 1885, in the Tabernacle. He proclaimed to the saints that this is just another episode in the eternal war between God's elect and the evil individuals, another moment of anti-Mormon prosecution, and that he would rally underneath the banner of heaven, this language that would later be appropriated, and that he would die for the truth rather than disobey God. And when he said that, he pounded the pulpit, and the entire audience clamored back, amen. And from that point on, John Taylor, the leader of the LDS Church, went on the underground. Now, when we say the underground, we mean that they are literal fugitives from the law. There are wanted posters like this one for John Taylor and George Buchanan to be arrested and sent to jail. They are in hiding. They are moving from place to place. Some go to foreign nations. Joseph F. Smith is sent to Hawaii. Other apostles are sent to London. Some go up to Canada. George Buchanan is on his way to Mexico when he is first arrested. And many of them will eventually serve prison sentences. The only LDS apostle who is not on the lam during this time is Franklin Richards, only because he is an elderly man. Most of his wives had passed away and he only had one living wife, so he technically counted as monogamous. They even used code names. One of my favorite documents I stumbled upon in the archives and the collection of John Whitaker, who I'll get to in just a second, was a list of all the different code names that were used for LDS leaders during this time so that they could communicate and send letters without the postmaster learning where they were. George Buchanan, by the way, when he was first arrested on his way to Mexico, he posted bail $45,000, and they chose to forfeit that bail money rather than him standing trial, which shows how radical their decisions had become. But I do want to talk about John Whitaker, this dapper young man here who is hired to work in the historian's office, and his records are some of the best records we have to understand the underground. He worked in the historian's office during the 1880s at a time when the historian's office became a hub of church activities during the underground years because Franklin Richards was the church historian and he was able to walk around in public. They kept a list of secret homes where church leaders were living in. They had code names. They had specific codes to where if someone knocks on their door a certain time, that would signify there are feds or there are not feds. One of my favorite anecdotes from this time is John Whitaker, while working for church leaders, fell in love with John Taylor's daughter, Ida. And then he wanted to marry her. The problem was he could never talk to John Taylor because he was on the run to get his permission for marriage. Eventually, John Taylor learns about John Whitaker's desire to marry his daughter, thought that he was keeping it from him, so he wrote a scathing letter, one of my favorite documents I've read, a scathing letter saying, why are you doing this subterfuge on marriage? And quote, there is nothing clandestine or undercover about the marriage procedure. And he writes this, of course, while he himself is hiding from the law law due to his marriages. It's just a wonderful anecdote that captures the conflicting emotions at the time. Now, while LDS leaders certainly suffered and they're having to run from place to place, John Taylor never gets to show his face in public again during his presidency. It is even worse for common members. More than 1,500 Utah residents faced trial during these years. 95% of those trials had to do with polygamy. Over 1,000 end up serving jail time, including both men and women, most serving for around 6 months in jail. Another of my favorite documentary sources for this era is these autograph books that they would keep, kind of like yearbooks that you would get in high school, except they're in jail and people would write poetry, some very, very bad poetry, I would add, and they would take photographs like this famous photograph of George Buchanan in jail. I mean, this is hyperbole, but it almost feels like there's as much photographs of George Buchanan in jail as out of jail because everyone wanted their photograph with George Buchanan when he finally went to jail. But more seriously, the economy plummeted in Utah because, as you imagine, all these workers are either on the run or in jail. And there were serious social repercussions for Salt Lake City become a ghost town. There's also lots of civil protests. The governor of Utah complained to the president of the United States that Mormons were launching, quote, grenades filled with human excrement at him, which just shows that even Mormons could get into these type of violent protests when they choose. So Utah, between 1885 and 1890, is this very tense moment where most of the men and women are on the run. No one can really show their face in public, and their economy plummets as a result. Things only seemed to get worse as the late 1880s advanced as well. Now, the Latter-day Saints did all they could to try to negotiate an end. Emmeline B. Wells, a wonderful leader in the women's organization, as well as other Relief Society delegates, traveled to Washington, D.C. to plead for mercy without much success. Emmeline B. Wells notes that the same women's suffragist leaders who had supported them in the past now turned their back. They tried to work with politicians in secret. They even tried to bribe some politicians in one of the rare situations in which bribery does not work in American politics. Because at every point, LDS leaders, especially John Taylor, refused to concede on the point of polygamy. Taylor remained resolute to his dying day, believing that we cannot give up polygamy, despite all the problems that are coming as a result. It is in that context that he writes the September 1886 revelation that was made available for researchers and the general public alike earlier this year for the first time. And when the U.S. president himself tried to broker behind-the-scenes negotiations with LDS leadership to stop this massive crisis going on that grabbed national attentions, John Taylor's message to the delegate in Washington, D.C. was clear, quote, "No surrender on the principle." It is in that spirit that John Taylor then died in 1887. And at first, Wilford Woodruff seemed to carry on that resolution. He had issued what Mormons called the Wilderness Revelation when he was on the run in Arizona and New Mexico, saying that the saints should never give up polygamy. However, soon it became unsustainable. In 1887, Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which intensified the government's ability to prosecute polygamists. It disincorporated the LDS Church. It dissolved their perpetual emigrating fund. It required loyalty oaths, saying oaths that you do not practice in polygamy in order to get the rights of citizenship. It removed spousal privilege in court cases, and it rescinded the women's right to vote, something that Emmeline B. Wells mourned. And as a visual of how desperate the church was in these moments, as the government started escheating property, taking the property from the church that exceeded the $50,000 limit that harkened all the way back to the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act in 1862. That meant the church handing over things like the Salt Lake Temple Square, which they did in November 1887. John Whitaker records in his diary, handing over the keys to the government for the Salt Lake City Temple, which the temple then rented back to the Latter-day Saints for $1 a month. Latter-day Saints appealed that decision and these laws to the Supreme Court, but it was becoming quite clear that the writing was on the wall. Soon, both sides were more willing to talk. On the one hand, the government reached out to Wilford Woodruff, and through an unofficial agreement, basically made it clear, we won't prosecute you because we believe the church is going to work better if they have someone in charge. So Wilford Woodruff got approval to walk around in broad daylight without the threat of being arrested. And in return, Wilford Woodruff and other church leaders recognized that it was unsustainable to retain their resistance, to maintain their civil disobedience, to continue to publicly defend and practice polygamy. If they did so, they would lose all their temples and all other property. And further, the younger Latter-day Saints were not showing as much devotion to the principle of polygamy as what would be required for them to continue. So there's both the external pressure and the internal dissension that made Wilford Woodruff and other church leaders recognize that polygamy has to be given up. So there's a slow process of concession. They stopped approving new plural marriages, at least publicly, in September of 1889. They released an official statement in October 1889 saying that we are not operating as an empire, we plan to follow the rules. The test oath in Idaho that would have disbarred all Latter-day Saints from the privileges of citizenship was reaffirmed in early 1890, and then the Edmunds-Tucker Act was vindicated by the Supreme Court in May of 1890. It was then that Latter-day Saint leaders like George Buchanan, as I've discussed in previous videos, started working with Republic officials that in return for finally giving up polygamy, they could form a new political alliance with the GOP. So Wilford Woodruff then issues the Manifesto, what comes to be known as Official Declaration 1 that fall, which shocked general members. When it was presented before the General Conference, there were some who did not really like it. Among them, B.H. Roberts, who had already become a prominent writer and historian and theologian and soon a leader in the LDS faith, who called it a cowardly affair. He, like thousands of other Latter-day Saints, had served time in jail for this principle that they believed the church was now giving up. B.H. Roberts refused to sustain the official declaration in General Conference, by the way, and many others reported that there is a gloomy pall over the faith at that General Conference. And then it's in the ensuing years, once the church publicly renounced polygamy, though secretly still practicing it, that they arranged with the government amnesty for all these leaders and commoners alike who had been breaking the law for years up until 1890. Besides being a fascinating and riveting story, one of the unheralded sagas in American religious history, I genuinely believe, this story has several crucial legacies and consequences and meanings for the Mormon tradition. First and foremost, it's the origins of Mormon fundamentalism, those who took John Taylor's words to heart, saying that giving up polygamy was a concession and a betrayal of the church's ideas. John Taylor's son, John W. Taylor, takes another plural wife within a week of that general conference in which they sustained the official manifesto, showing that polygamy was not going anywhere anytime soon, something I've talked about in previous video. It also reaffirmed and strengthened this tradition within the Mormon tradition of quote-unquote lying for the Lord, meaning that it is okay to avoid telling the truth or even breaking the law when it accords with the divine will. This is how one church leader, Charles Penrose, who was a Salt Lake City stake leader at the time, would later join the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency. He says that, quote, "The endless subterfuges and prevarications which our present conditions impose threaten to make our rising generation a race of deceivers." That was a fear from within the tradition itself. And we see that crop up every once in a while, the justification for bad behavior if it's in the cause of the Lord. And finally, we see this legacy of extremism and zeal and extra political, extra legal action that resurrects itself every once in a while with the Laffertys, with the story told in John Krakauer's best-selling Under the Banner of Heaven, right? A phrase that comes from John Taylor during this era to explain the type of extremism that is bubbling up from that tradition. Although I want to emphasize the Krakauer book has fundamental flaws and problems, and that connection of how extremism works within the tradition is probably a topic for another video. But we even see a more mild version, although still quite extreme, with people like Ammon Bundy, who is trying to resurrect that extreme idea in the modern world and fights with the federal government, once again, in the American West. In other words, the legacies of the underground still sit with us today. And that's it. That's the history of the underground, at least a broad overview. I hope to dig into some of the more particulars in future videos, and I'll be able to cite back to this video for the general narrative. If I missed anything, if you think that there's something crucial to the story that I'm overlooking, please let me know in the comments. If you want to read more, if you want to learn more about the underground, again, one of the most fascinating epics in American religious history, I have two book recommendations for you. Well, one's a book and one's a set of primary sources. The book is Sarah Berenger Gordon's The Mormon Question: Polygamy and Constitutional Conflict in 19th Century America. One of my favorite history books ever written because it looks at this broader episode, all the debates, and what it tells us about American fights over the Constitution. And then if you wanted to get some primary sources, the LDS Church History Library published the Belle Harris Diaries. Belle Harris was a plural wife who was imprisoned for 4 months in 1883, and those records are rich in meaning and tell us what the lived reality was. Because when we talk about the Mormon Underground, yes, we need to talk about the leaders like John Taylor, but we also need to talk about the common figures like Belle Harris, who are experiencing the consequences of the church's position. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, make sure to hit the like button, share with others so we can broaden the conversation. You can subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and if you want to give back, you can become a member. Also, please make sure you're subscribed to my Kit newsletter, which you can find a link in the video description. History has never been more relevant than it is today, because not only does it provide us these fascinating stories, but it gives context to the legacies and tensions that we are still struggling with, tensions that still shape the present just as much as they were created in the past.